And fears of a devastating tsunami across the Pacific have faded after one of the strongest earthquakes on record off the coast of eastern Russia. The tremor struck early on Wednesday morning off the Kamchatka Peninsula, sparking alerts and evacuation orders across the Pacific. Millions were forced to evacuate and flee to higher ground. But now that the ocean surge has reached South America with no reported damage, many of those alerts have been lifted and evacuees are returning home.
Waves measuring up to 70 centimeters were recorded along the coastline of Easter Island in Chile. Residents responded quickly to initial warnings of an incoming tsunami, but the worst never came.
We heard about the earthquake yesterday, and at the hostel itself, they told us there was going to be this evacuation, and that this was the safe zone.
These are the scenes of early Wednesday morning when one of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded struck Russia's remote east coast. The 8.8 magnitude quake triggered a tsunami that affected parts of Russia's Kuril Islands and Japan's northern island of Hokkaido. In Japan, nearly 2 million people evacuated to higher ground in towns along the Pacific coast.
I grabbed only what I could and walked here with others. I feel safer here as there are other people.
Tsunami waves also reached coastal areas of Hawaii Island and the US West Coast. But despite the sheer scale of the quake, no significant damage was reported. With most tsunami warnings now downgraded or lifted, a potentially devastating scenario appears to have been averted.
All right, let's get more from Emily Brodsky. She is a distinguished professor of Earth and Planetary Science at the University of California. Welcome, Professor. Now, the scale of the damage was thankfully much smaller than expected. Can you tell us why?
Sure. Well, when we have a big earthquake like this, we worry about two things. One is shaking damage of nearby cities, and this was a pretty remote area that was offshore, so the shaking damage wasn't as bad as it could have been in a different location that was more densely populated. And then the tsunami, whether or not a tsunami is big, is very, very sensitive to exactly how much the seafloor moves. And this one, it's hard to tell from across the globe exactly how much it moved, but it looked like it moved about 10 meters. And that just didn't displace quite as much water as a very similar earthquake that occurred almost the same place in 1952. That was a magnitude 9 and caused significant damage in Hawaii and also Russia. So, you know, a magnitude 8.8 is actually much smaller than a magnitude 9. And so that little bit of difference in magnitude made a really big difference in terms of the tsunami that was produced.
Speaking of earthquakes more than 8.8 magnitude, the 2011 earthquake off the coast of Japan, you helped organize and led a major international expedition to study that fault. How does this latest earthquake compare to the one in 2011?
It's it's hard to say from this far away. What we did in Japan is actually get to the seafloor and look at the earthquake and look at the fault, which obviously we haven't had an opportunity to do yet in Kamchatka. But 2011 moved the seafloor right next to the fault, probably about 70 meters, which is sort of mind-boggling amount to move in the ground in 10 minutes. And that pushed up a huge column of water that then created the tsunami that devastated northern Japan. Whereas, as I was starting to say, that this Kamchatka earthquake, probably the angle of the fault where it hit the seafloor was just a little bit different. So it was a little less vertical motion, and it was probably a lot less just slip on the fault, probably closer to 10 than 70. And that makes all the difference in terms of the size of the tsunami produced.
Now, your research is looking at potentially being able to predict major seismic events. How far along are you on that front?
Not anywhere near as far as we would like. This earthquake is particularly interesting because it had a large number of smaller earthquakes before the big earthquake. It had 4 shocks. And the migration of those 4 shocks over the week before the earthquake, and a lot like what we saw before the Japan earthquake and another earthquake in 2014 in Chile. And so what we're really missing here is sort of a frustrating earthquake because we don't have the instruments at the fault and nearby enough to actually say whether the fault was moving slowly before it moved quickly.
Right.
And if we had had that here, it would be a very different story.
We'll leave that there for the moment. Emily Brodsky, Professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at the University of California. Thank you so much.
We'll speak now to journalist Sonia Blashka in Tokyo about the tsunami that hit Japan. Sonia, considering the magnitude of the quake, almost the scale of the quake that triggered the 2011 tsunami, how has Japan reacted to it?
I think Japan has reacted in a very composed way, in a relatively calm way, considering the circumstances. And it's probably one of the countries which is the most well prepared to this sort of potential disaster. Japan has learned a lot of lessons from the 2011 earthquake and tsunami, and the region that is still under a tsunami advisory now is actually that coast from 2011 and also Hokkaido. So there people still are kind of careful, you know, observing what's happening, watching the news, following that very closely. Some people still evacuated to higher ground. They changed whole landscapes, moved villages higher up, and also installed new tsunami evacuation towers, updated floodgates, stairs. So Japan is a really well-prepared country when it comes to tsunamis. They have to be.
And nearly 2 million people were evacuated. That's quite a lot. How was that done, and what were the biggest challenges when it came to moving that large number of people?
I mean, the obvious challenges are you have to prepare shelter. There's the danger of traffic jams. You have to prepare food. Obviously, traffic disruptions were a big issue. But this time, really, the biggest challenge was the heat. You mentioned it earlier in the program. Japan has experienced the highest temperatures on record. And several people were actually taken to hospital for heat stroke. So also during the day, the authorities were kind of torn between you know, we have to ask people to stay in these safe places, but what do we do when they are outside in the heat under the scorching sun? So that was really difficult this time. And now it's typhoon season in Japan, so we're here in Tokyo waiting for the typhoon number 9, I think, arriving tomorrow or the day after. How would this change if you've got a typhoon coming up towards the country, and at the same time you have to evacuate hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people? So that's a very different challenge. And then there's the invisible challenges of people still remembering what happened back then, you know, flashbacks, trauma coming up. A man, he said he remembered what happened back then and his whole body started shaking and he was unable to move. So if you enter into this sort of freeze response, that's a very, obviously a very difficult situation to be in. And these sort of invisible challenges are some that Japan still has to tackle.
Journalist Sonia Blashka in Tokyo, thank you for that update.
You're welcome.